All right, everybody. Sorry about that quick delay. Of course, we are having just some technical difficulties and all getting used to this brand new platform, but we're going to get started and kind of wait for our other panelists to get settled. But if you haven't met me yet, my name's Laura Brawarney. I'm the CWAM annual meeting team lead. So all of our successes and foibles, you can take those concerns up with me throughout this conference, but we're just really great. We're really happy to have you all here for our first panel discussion on land acknowledgement. I'm joined on screen right now by Garrett Briggs. He is a NAGPRA coordinator for the Southern Ute Indian Tribe. I also have on audio Betsy Chapoose, who is here from the Ute Indian Tribe. She is the Cultural Rights and Protections Director over there in Utah. So she's joining us just with audio. So you'll hear her chiming in actually through my phone on my office. So some new adventures that we're trying out. And so if you hear anything weird with sound, feel free to chime in the chat, and I will try to troubleshoot that as we go along. And also on the right hand of your screen in the event chat, you'll see a little Q&A tab. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A as we go along. I will be sort of managing those as we go through this session, and we'll try to get through as many of your questions as possible. So just to introduce kind of what we're talking about here, we are going to talk a little bit about land acknowledgements, and I'll let you in on how we got to this topic. You know, we're talking about healing and wanting to reach out to our communities and try to restore some of the previous injustices and to acknowledge people who have not been acknowledged the right way in the past. And through discussions on the board, we were like, oh, you know, land acknowledgements. People have asked us if CWAM has a land acknowledgement. We thought, oh, that's a great way, you know, to start to embrace healing. We were a little stumped when we were thinking about a generic CWAM land acknowledgement because we have all of Colorado and Wyoming. That was just sort of a very daunting task. And so we thought, wouldn't it be great to bring in some experts to sort of create a workshop? They'll just give us the basics, boom, 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 here's how you write one, and then everyone can go off and create these great land acknowledgement statements. So I brought this up to Garrett, and he very, very kindly informed me that there is not really a one-size-fits-all approach to this process, and he actually taught me some really important lessons about land acknowledgement. And so we decided rather than doing a workshop, we would have a panel with him and some of his colleagues to just talk about how complicated this process is and give us some guidance on the right ways to do it. So to open things up, Garrett, if you wouldn't mind just sort of expanding on, you know, the problems behind this one-size-fits-all approach for creating a land acknowledgement and why that doesn't work.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Garrett Briggs, NAGPRA coordinator for the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, or the male counterpart. The female counterpart should be hopping on soon. Her name is Cassandra Atencio. It's good to have you also on the call, Betsy. Glad to have you here and get your insight. So when Ms. Brawarney and I were talking, you know, during our discussion about land acknowledgements, I wanted to warn her about the pitfalls of using a one-size-fits-all approach. And in order to understand my advice, the one who is championing the creation of a land acknowledgement needs to comprehend that the US government several years back recognized 574 tribes in the United States. And while this number likely increased since that time, each tribe, each sovereign nation has their own culture, history, language, and cosmology, or the way in which their oral history dictates how they came to be today. So before starting, the person who is pursuing the development of a land acknowledgement needs to accept this fact. And therefore, just drafting a one-size-fits-all approach for the development of a land acknowledgement is problematic because it is reminiscent of how the majority often placed Native peoples into one category. We all lived in teepees, we all rode horses, and we all looked the same. So hence the approach for developing a cookie cutter land acknowledgement will likely be interpreted by Indigenous people as presumptive and paternalistic. Thus, it would behoove any proponent who wants to draft a land acknowledgement or has that idea to move forward on is to approach official tribal representatives in a collaborative manner. In the past, we have been approached in different ways, and one way was that they typed up the land acknowledgement and handed it off to us for review. And so that paternalism, like I mentioned, can be displayed and interpreted in different ways, and that can really get you off to the wrong start and on the wrong foot in the beginning. So that's something that I just wanted to share with you all, is that I think land acknowledgements are useful in certain capacities, but one must take the first step that it's a correct step in the beginning. So that's essentially what I was referring to when I spoke to you about that. Thank you.
When you are doing land acknowledgements, you should understand why you're doing that acknowledgement, and not just simply write it up and send it along the way to a tribe and say, this is what I wrote, what do you think? Help me edit this a little bit, because if you don't know the history behind the land acknowledgement, the area that you're in and which tribes were part of that, you may misstep there. In my experience, I've probably worked on over 40 of them with different organizations throughout Utah and Colorado. Here in Utah, the governor 2 years ago signed a document, an executive order for each, for any state organization and facility building that they're in, to create a land acknowledgement to the Indigenous people of that area. And so I've worked on a number of them with a number of organizations, but the thing is that I'm seeing is that they really don't know their history. They want to write really flowery things that are very romanticized and poetic, but yet it does not reflect the true history of how the Native Americans were removed from those lands. And so that's been one heartburn that going through these land acknowledgements that I've really had going along the way. So I think it's, first of all, you should educate yourself about the people that were in your region and where you're developing this land acknowledgement. Secondly of all, if you want the tribes to have buy-in with it, you should collaborate with them and have them help you write that land acknowledgement if you're not sure what wording to use. And thirdly, if you have a written land acknowledgement and you send that to somebody to edit it or have input on it, you really need to listen to the input. Because I found that with several of the organizations, they had a set way that they wanted it. And even if I was educating them a little bit on the history and how we were removed and all of that, they did not want to take those edits. So I think you need to be very open-minded, but I would say collaboration is the biggest step. Get to know the people that you're trying to acknowledge in that land acknowledgement, and talk to them a little bit and have them help you understand what that land acknowledgement is about. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to pause and take a minute to introduce Cassandra Atencio, who's joining us. She is also a NAGPRA coordinator for the Southern Ute Indian Tribe. So we're happy to have you here, Cassandra. Thanks for joining us. So we were just talking about the pitfalls of a one-size-fits-all land acknowledgement statement, and Betsy mentioned some really important points about our choice of language and how I think museums have not museums, only museums, but organizations in general have a tendency to try and make the language sound prettier than the situation actually was. And so I wondered if any of you had some great examples of language to avoid or just really poor choices that you've seen happen in land acknowledgements that you would warn us against?
Good afternoon, Mike. My name is Cassandra Atencio. I have my input for that. Would it be some pitfall is lumping us all together, thinking that each tribe is the same as another tribe, as another tribe, as another tribe. The other thing is that to understand that which tribe you're speaking to. For instance, us Ute people, we were in familial bands, and those familial bands differed in ways, in subtle ways, that you can't make a general statement about Ute people, because one family may have done something differently than another family, and it would be based on location where you might be at that time. And so I think you have to know a little bit of your back history when you start to do that. And just like Betsy and Mr. Briggs said, is collaboration and reaching out to the tribes is a good first step. Thank you.
And I'd definitely like to add to that in the sense of understanding the history of the area in which you were writing the land acknowledgement for, as mentioned by Ms. Japus, is the fact that looking at talking to the people whose ancestors occupied the area, and not just simply relying upon Wikipedia or the Indian Claims Commission, because it really narrows the scope in which how they represent the history of the area, in better words. And so being able to talk to the tribes whose ancestral lands this land acknowledgement is occurring on is really important, because a lot of tribes are displaced during, for example, Manifest Destiny and the push west. So where they are now may not necessarily be where they were then. And so oral history and working with the appropriate official cultural representatives for the tribes will be very beneficial if you do continue moving down that path to write a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thanks.
And this is Betsy, and I think the other thing is that the history of removal is harsh, and it's not something that should be glossed over or made light of. You know, I was helping a small museum in Colorado write one, and they wanted to say something along the lines of that the Utes simply moved off and then they came in and occupied the land, when we all know that we were, as for the Ute Indian tribe in Utah, we were forcibly removed out from the western slope of Colorado, and we were marched across the land there for hundreds of miles to get to where we are today. And the reality of that is it's not pretty. It's very harsh when we're walking and we have soldiers on horses with guns moving us across the landscape. And I think that's the reality of what you're looking at. And you need to really look at that, like Mr. Briggs said, that it's Wikipedia and all of the stuff that are kind of glossing over that history. That is why you need to really form a relationship with the tribes that you're trying to, or the area that, and find out what their history is, how they see their history. It's not always the way you read it in the writing it. So I think that's the other thing, is you have to really have a reality, and you have to look at the stark truth of that.
Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, I think that's something that came up when I was initially speaking with Mr. Briggs, is just getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because these are not fun things to talk about. And something that he brought up to me was intent, and that's a really important topic. I think we've already touched on a little bit. And, you know, the intent should not be, you know, I want to make myself feel better as a museum professional and do this thing and check it off my box. So I do want to ask if you have any input on, you know, the different intentions that you've experienced. You know, why Why do museums want to do this, and what are the most constructive intentions behind creating a land acknowledgement statement?
This is Cassandra. I think the intent or for some acknowledgments from museums should be that it's still a living and it's in present. A lot of times we are colored as being some peoples that lived in the past, you know, that we're no longer there anymore. And we kind of faded away into the sunset somewhere in history books and in your school books, you know, because I certainly don't read about myself. It didn't read about myself in my school books, in my history books. In fact, it seems like everything about Native Americans and you people, in fact, ended at the Indian Wars, you know, and after that, there's no acknowledgement, you know, and I say that because there was a boarding school era, there was a assimilation era, there was a, you know, when they moved the people to the cities, tribes to the cities, you know, and there's a lot of that stuff that's missing in the books and in the reality. And I think so. I think instead of painting us as a picture of people that lived in the past, that we're still here and we're still connected and we are here in the present day wearing the same clothes that we have adapted to, you know, it's not assimilated, but adapting to your surroundings. And we have done that, you know, we are still here. And that's, I think that's one thing that needs to be brought out is that we're not colored in that black and white in the past type of scenario. Thank you.
And building upon what Ms. Atencio shared, as you know, if you're looking at intent, you're looking at approach. And so the way in which you approach a land acknowledgement is very significant because whose timeline are you working on? Are you working on your own timeline because your boss gave you a deadline and this has to be completed because it's a task that's on your to-do list? And if that is, then I think you need to circle back to looking at what your intent is. And if your intent is just to simply check a box, as was alluded to earlier, or to fulfill a task, then you're already approaching it incorrectly. And you're presenting an intent that is not meaningful. And if it's in a meaningful intent, as Cassandra mentioned, look at using present tense words and looking at the continued connection of the people to the land, regardless if they are still in that state or not, regardless if they're still occupying those lands or not. It's a fact of allowing for the indigenous people to speak for themselves. And as mentioned earlier, is being comfortable with being uncomfortable, because a lot of things are very difficult to discuss. So, for example, as you asked us about intent, and it's kind of hard because intent is largely based on individual perception, and that is largely driven by your approach, your behavior, and your intent to initiate this process. So it's all involved in intent, approach, and also interpretation or perception. So once again, if you're approaching it with more of a collaborative mindset, that's going to be a better way to do things than starting off on the wrong foot, as we kind of circle back to the opening statement. So you have to really look introspectively into yourself and see why this task has been given to you and what the intent is, or what your personal intent is to pursuing this land acknowledgement. So I think that, looking at the intent, that would be my best interpretation of what intent and approach is. Thanks.
Thank you. So we do have a question that's come up from Robert Henning. He's up in Gillette, Wyoming, and he asks, many of our museums have either never had or have had poor relationships with tribes. What suggestions do you have for reaching out to tribal leaders to build those relationships?
I think, first of all, you need to look at your surroundings and who are those tribes? Maybe you have a state office that keeps a list of the tribes that they consult with, or do you have a federal agency close by, BLM, Forest Service, somebody that you can call and say, hey, who are those tribes that you engage with? And I think you need to reach out and introduce yourself. I always use the analogy of this is a courting process. Think of tribes as, you're going to court them, so you want to reach out and introduce yourself. Then you want to get to know them a little bit, just like they want to get to know you. So you kind of do that little dance of familiarizing yourself with each other. See what your likes and your dislikes are. When you meet somebody, you don't just walk up to them and immediately ask them for something. Nobody likes a needy friend, so don't be a needy friend. Make sure that you're approaching them just as you would somebody that you want to get to know, create a relationship with. It's the same way with tribes. We don't want a needy friend that every time we see your number pop up on our phone, we're like, oh my gosh, now what's going on? Now what do they need? I always like to use that analogy because we can all relate to it. So, I would say that's your first few steps, is getting to know who are those tribes and those people. Most generally, you'll meet the cultural resource people in the tribe first before you meet anybody. And they are good. Those cultural resource people are good people to say, who can we get? It's just like some tribes, up north, they do quilting. They make star quilts. They do that type of stuff. I've heard of a museum that had a exhibit on quilting. They called that tribe and they had a relationship, and they said, hey, we know that you guys make these star quilts. Why don't you come in? We're starting a quilting club here. And they started to build that relationship off from that. Do things to tribes besides with an ask. And most of all, do not engage. You don't want your engagement with them to be the first thing is nag for talking about human remains, because, you don't want to meet somebody and just say, okay, well, here we go. We're going to go down this very sensitive road about talking about something that's very dear and sensitive to people. And that can really set you off on the wrong foot, especially if you don't approach the process in a culturally sensitive way. So I would say that's your initial step. That would be how I think collaboration should start.
Thank you.
And I really believe what Ms. Chaput said really brings up an important point, that when you start working with the cultural preservation representatives, who are the officially designated individuals who work on projects that are associated with things that we're talking about, is that asking them what is the culturally appropriate way to ask an elder to be involved in the project, to take into their cultural, approach, to how things are done appropriately, will go a long way. Because oftentimes, I think that a lot of people in the U.S., and rightfully so, in other countries, they assume that their cultural norms are your cultural norms, and they're incorrect by making that assumption. It's best to, build a rapport with those cultural preservation representatives, or those who are tasked with taking care of these projects and or repatriations of ancestors and so forth, is to ask them what's culturally appropriate. It's a simple question. And at least from the onset, in my perspective, if somebody would ask me that would be a good step in the right direction. And just following suit with what is provided as insight. Thank you.
Hi, this is Cassandra. I want to concur with both Mr. Briggs and what Ms. Chaput have to say about how to approach a tribe, especially if you had bad relationships before. I think that, the reintroduction of yourself goes a long way, and starting to, and the building of that relationship. Betsy has a bunch of Betsy-isms that I call them. I call on them because she is my mentor, along with, she just build, for 20 plus years, along with, Mr. Terry Knight of the Inuit tribe as advisors, and along with my late father, Mr. Alden Naranjo, I got, for the tribe, and utilizing what they've gone through and seeing how those relationships have been enduring, especially when there's changeover, and then that reintroduction happens, and that already built relationship goes a long way with getting whatever you need done. But you need to approach it and be respectful and be polite. We all learned manners when we were growing up, and I think that's just, that's a good way to start. Thank you.
Another thing I'd like to add to that, I know that we can go on and on. Oh, I'll let you go. Sorry.
When you're reaching out to the tribes, be mindful of their time. A lot of times we get approached and people want to talk, which is fine, but we, as cultural resource people, we deal with all federal and state agencies within our ancestral lands, and that includes about 5-6 states. So, if you want to talk, you make sure that you give them a call and say, this is me, and I'd like to have about half an hour of your time. When would be the most convenient? Don't just call up and think that we're going to be on the phone with you because we're sitting around waiting for the phone to ring, because that's not quite the case. So I want to say that about that line of respect, is to make sure that you respect the tribe's time. Thank you.
And that's essentially what I was going to say, that what Ms. Bruce brought up also was respecting time, but also when it comes down to time, understanding the passage of time and institutional knowledge and institutional relationships. Because the biggest thing that I've learned with lived experience in this position within the last 4 years, which I was cognizant of prior to getting into this position, but I didn't fully realize or appreciate the development of working relationships over decades. And so with a lot of the work that Ms. Chapus, she did with Mr. Duncan, and what Cassandra had done with Mr. Naranjo, was that a lot of those working relationships, I actually got off a meeting recently before this conference with a longstanding colleague, Ms. Monterano, and she's been working with the Ute sister tribes for 20 plus years. And so if you're in that position, for example, you establish a good working relationship with a tribe, and you know that you're leaving, plan on at least asking or volunteering your time if you're not going to get paid, if you're still in the same area, your boss, or just arranging it to happen, to make sure you make that introduction and you take time to talk to the person who's coming into your position and pass that baton on and explain, based upon your experience and your relationship with those tribal members, those representatives, why these relationships are so important. Thankfully, I've been able to witness that in a couple of different instances. But that is, once you get the relationship established, make sure that you're passing that information on to the person behind you, your successor, because that will strengthen, that bond. And it will also create an opportunity for, if that individual who is your successor runs into a challenge, they may feel comfortable in going back and asking their predecessor, what would you do in this instance? So that you're taking the appropriate time and the personal and professional touch, using that approach to, manage those relationships, because nothing is ever done in isolation. And once you're able to create a relationship, you do your best to uphold it and follow through on promises that you make. So as we kind of discuss this topic, it's just, common decency, but it goes a little bit further, because you have to realize that the projects that you're working on with these representatives can either be their ancestors, sacred objects, or otherwise, items of cultural importance that haven't been in the tribe's possession or with their right to repatriate and rebury an ancestor for sometimes 30, 40 years. So you got to be able to understand from a human capacity of what these relationships really are, because they go beyond just, colleagueship or professional relationships. They become a working friendship. So just think about how much time you spend on those relationships that you have with individuals outside of work and in your life, and look at it that way. So it's not just, as we've always, fallen back on by saying, it's just checking a box. It's not, it's way beyond that. So you really have to take time to nurture those relationships.
So since NAGPRA, now it's been over 20 years, the sort of buzzword has been consultation, and that has been the gold standard, for how to work with tribes. It's consultation. But also now hearing this discussion of, your time is valuable, and yes, it is your job to help do this, but also you've got a million other things to do. So what are some things that we as museum professionals need to look out for so we don't cross that line from consultation to, exploitation?
I don't know. This is Cassandra. I want to point out that consultation is just that, and it's not one and done. Don't make the mistake that just because you've talked to a tribe at one time that you're done your task. Such as, and that's in reference to that check in the box. And I think that since NAGPRA has been implemented, people take the sense of perversing or utilizing that word consultation and making that definition to suit whatever their needs are. And to me, a consultation is straight out of the book. It's discussing, it's seeking, and it's coming to terms and coming to agreement, which means that you're actually sitting down with the tribe and talking to them and discussing with them what are the best steps, not just what your steps are, but you're working together to develop the steps. Because these plans of actions, when it comes to NAGPRA and when it comes to repatriations, aren't just for the museum. It's for the tribe, and it's also for that inner healing. These people, these old people that have been there, that have been disturbed, they didn't mean, there was they didn't have an intention of coming back up, or to be exhumed, or to be put on a shelf, or to be studied, and so you need to look at it from the perspective of, that was my grandma, and we think of them as our grandmothers and our grandfathers and people that we're tied to, because our prayers, their prayers are tied to us because they prayed for us when they were making those prayers and setting them down in those different areas. Just like when we pray, we don't just pray for ourselves. We pray for our community. We pray for the children and those children that come after them. We may not be around, but those prayers include them. So to speak, that 7 generations down the line and that 7 generations before us. And so, that sense that cultural awareness and knowing that, this is beyond religious terms, it's beyond a specimen. This has something that is indelible, that is a part of us. And I think that that when you take consultation, you got to really think about it, and it's dialogue. Thank you.
That's another theme that I've heard is, sort of by getting to know the tribes in your area, you're trying to humanize them. And I forget whether it was Miss Atencio or Miss Chapus that I was speaking to, but we talked about how we often see museums being so proud, like, oh, we're repatriating these remains, and they're, celebrating it. But then if you look at it from the other side, you are bringing someone, the body of their ancestor after it's been dug up from where it was meant to stay forever. And so just thinking in terms of what feels good to you as a museum professional probably doesn't feel great to the tribes that you might be working with. And so that goes back to, what we're saying about getting to know those tribes. And as Ms. Atencio said, collaboration isn't one and done. It's something that you need to continue. But going back to collaboration, is it, if we go sort of in the opposite direction, is it all right for an organization to just give you the work to do and expect you to do it all for them and say like, oh, we're consulting? So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a really fine line. And once again, it comes down to building that rapport and that working relationship with the tribal governments and their representatives. But it's really tough, because I was kind of looking at some of your questions too about the land acknowledgement and how kind of everything fits together. Because, as we start looking at NAGPRA and our ancestors' connection to the land and so forth, and the repatriation efforts, but taking into account, like one of your questions about, is it better, what's worse in your opinion about a poorly researched land acknowledgement or none at all? It comes down to building those relationships and the understanding that you're also accepting what their oral history tells them. And with that respect to where they originated and so forth. So looking at kind of that connection between, building a relationship with tribes, NAGPRA, land acknowledgements, I guess what one has to realize, and it's hard for academically Euro-American trained minds to think this way, and it took me a little while too, coming out of academia again and coming back to my community, was that everything is interwoven. It's never done separately, because there's relationships that are established based upon long-standing projects and so forth, and multiple projects. So looking at how everything's connected, it really helps to better understand where we're going with, say, land acknowledgements, because everything's tied together. So it's very, it's to the point where it's inseparable. But kind of looking at it, I think that getting back to the land acknowledgements portion is that really comes down to relationships, and all of what we've been sharing today really revolves around that, and taking into account cultural differences, what is socially acceptable based upon the native nations that you're working with and so forth is just. And you're right, with the repatriation efforts of museums holding stuff up and saying, look what we did this, we did it, yeah. It's like there's no real way to explain the feeling that you have when a repatriation occurs. It's not elation, it's not happiness, it's not completely devastating. It's somewhere in the middle. It's a liminal state that there's not a really good word to explain what the feeling is. So just being able to approach things in a very culturally sensitive manner is what it comes down to. And listening to what the tribes have to say and utilizing that information moving forward, because the last thing that any tribe wants to do is spend time on a project where the project proponent dismisses everything they did, everything they said, all the input they provided. And that really ruins relationships. That I've even seen evolve into today's time with different agencies we work with, because it takes a long time to build back that trust.
I think the relationship has to be based on respect. It's even the manner in which you speak of those ancestors, the words that you're using. If you use very clinical words, you're going to see the reaction out of the tribal people, because it's much like you're saying, these are their relations. These are the people that came before us, and why we're here, and where we're at right now. So even the words that you speak needs to be in an appropriate way. But I think the other part of what we're talking about too is proper compensation for what they're doing. Sure, this is something that we do for those ancestors, but at the same time, there is proper compensation for that, whether that be monetary, whether that be appropriate gifts, feeding people. You respect that time and what people have given you for helping you through this, because we're helping you. We're helping you to correct something that was done badly, and we're taking that on. And one thing about NAGPRA that doesn't get spoken about is these people that rebury our ancestors, they carry that burden with them. This is more than just let's go out and rebury something and walk away. They carry that with them for the rest of their lives. They take that responsibility for that ancestors being to be taken care of, to talk to them, to say, hey, we're putting you here, and we hope that you can rest and you can move on your journey. These are very, very, very personal things. And we ask people in our tribes to take that burden on. So when you look at it like that, the compensation for that needs to be just. And whether that is that you respect and listen to what they're telling you, whether that's, you sit down and feed these people or whatever it is. I know that there's regulations that some agencies and museums and whatever cannot do some of that. But in a way, you need to pay that back to them in that way. Be respectful, mindful. I always talk about being respectful and mindful because this is even your museum work, you may not even know what you have. You may not even know items, how special that is. The other part of it is in the NAGPRA, there are certain things that are not considered part of the NAGPRA items that tribal folks do. It is to them. So, you need to come up to that determination of are we going to be technical and push that at the sensitive way, of the sensitive issue. I mean, those are all things, and I think once you start to create a relationship with a tribe, you're going to see that differently. You're going to see that in your heart, in your mind, that this is a different thing, even with the objects and the exhibits that you have. Because in our way, everything has an essence. Everything is intertwined. Everything is interrelated. You can't separate the sunlight from the ground or the air from the water. That all comes together for a purpose. And that's what you're going to learn, and that's what you're going to learn to feel when you work with tribes in a respectful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. So
I wanted to answer some of that. This is Cassandra. I think the one word you get out of when you do that is a little bit of something off of your shoulders. If it's not weight, but a little bit. Per museum, we did something with the school, with the university, with the college that was out of compliance for over, since the 90s. And we just got done with the partial repatriation and reburial. And to wait for that lady, it was relief for her because it was something that she was fighting against her own academia, against her own college. So in a little bit of way, that little bit of weight was lifted off of her shoulder. In another way, we helped her by thanking her, and we helped ourselves by being respectful, like Ms. Chapus and Mr. Briggs are talking about, to that ancestor. And so some of it is that, and some of that is sorrow. You cry and you feel sorrow. And like Ms. Chapus said, it takes a lot. It takes a lot out of them people that are doing this for us, especially those tribal people. That is a responsibility, and it's not unlike what you ask a priest to do, but more so because it's tied to intangibility and it's tied to somebody that belongs within your scope of where your people are, and it hurts. It hurts because you didn't want to see them come up, and you didn't want to have to view them like that. And then all of your ugly history comes to light and it hits you in the face. You don't want to hear about it, because then you see cranial studies in your face when you're putting that person back. And how unmindful for somebody to think that was just a specimen and that it was okay to do that. That isn't okay. And it's not okay to see it and say, here, look at this I want you to study it. Tell me what this bone means. It's not okay. And so all those feelings come to light. All those things that she said you carry here, you have to carry it there. But then you have to go out to grandma and have her give it back to her in order for you to go on. There's things that go on within your own self that you have to do to help yourself, to help them people that do this stuff for you, to help them to ease their burden that they have to carry. Because like she said, it becomes a part of you. All them places, all them people become a part of you. They never, ever leave you. And that's still types of feelings that you get. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Atencio. I just want to thank all of you again for sharing all of these things so honestly with us. This is, a really great conversation that we're having. And, these emotions are real. And I think, it's helpful to see this impact that a lot of us don't even know that we're having on these communities. So again, we just really appreciate you sharing so openly and honestly with us here. Garrett, did you have anything to add to this stream, or shall we?
I think that, both Ms. Chabuse and Ms. Atencio have done a good job, on providing just, some thorough background and using, I guess, a wider brush to understand, how everything's interconnected, but also looking at, it's really personal to Native people. And so looking at, once again, your intent for, writing land acknowledgements and things like that, it's just, what is the purpose, to fulfill an objective that you've been tasked with or not, but also looking at, the understanding of the anguish, but also the hardships, placed on Indigenous people when you're writing these things. So it's not just, as was mentioned earlier, it's not a one and done. So it may take some time to formulate that relationship before you get to writing a land acknowledgement, because there's a lot to understand, digest, and consider while writing a land acknowledgement. It's not just saying that these people were here at one time, now we're here. And also I think that, I guess the one thing I can add too is that when writing a land acknowledgement, you need to ensure, and it's hard to do this because it's a document that often lives beyond the author or the authors in this case, is that you don't want it to become a platitude. You don't want it to become something you just recite and something that you do that's just, a ritual in a way, based upon like an anthropological definition of a ritual, is that it's kind of like, when you're younger, and I used this example before, is that when you learn the Pledge of Allegiance, you're too young to fully grasp what it means, what it entails, and what is emotionally tied to standing up, staring at the flag, reciting, a statement to pledge your allegiance to the United States. And then when you get older, you start realizing more of the importance behind it, but also the symbolism and the emotion and the history. So as you think about writing a land acknowledgement, it's really important to think about those things moving forward, that it has a meaning, that it has a purpose, that it doesn't just become something that's said every day out of, just habit or forced repetition, that you don't fully appreciate what it is. So just making sure that it keeps its meaning and doesn't just become something you just have to do before the meeting gets started. Thank you.
Great. So with that said, would you suggest that maybe a land acknowledgement is not a stagnant document? Is it something that should be revisited and revised every few years? Or is it, how much is that information going to change? Do we need to keep revisiting those every few years?
The tribal history. This is
Go ahead, Betsy.
Oh, I think it's dependent upon the organization, because I think a land acknowledgement also reflects the thought of that organization. And if they're growing and learning, it may be that they look at that and say, we need to add this and we need to add that. And as your relationship is blooming with the tribes or other aspects, it may change in that way, and it is a living acknowledgement. It is something that you can even maybe you really didn't collaborate a whole lot when you wrote that, and now you have a better understanding. So then you pull the tribes in and say, we would like to really put some thought into this, or maybe you've learned a new aspect of the tribe and their histories, and you want to include that. So I don't think that you write the land acknowledgement and you chisel it in stone and let it sit there for another 1,000 years before you take a look at it again. I do think it's a living statement that you want to polish up every now and then.
Absolutely, thank you.
And in that same token, I think that it could also be a good starting point for additional conversations, such as agreement documents between, for example, counties and tribes, where there's no necessarily a federal nexus that mandates consultation on proposed undertakings. So I think that, as Betsy was, stating, I think that looking at it as a living document to see not only, yay, we completed a land acknowledgement, but how do you really appreciate, or how do you show appreciation for that relationship? Do you truly, involve those tribes in either the organization or the management of the cultural resources that are associated with that group of people? I mean, it can be a starting point, because we receive land acknowledgement requests from a lot of different government organizations, but also institutions. So it's a wide swath. For example, with the Boulder County, there is an Indigenous Peoples Day. And I don't know if there's a specific land acknowledgement yet, but I think that's part of the development process. But there is an agreement document between Boulder County and the tribes that ascribe cultural affiliation to the area. But then we get land acknowledgement requests from was it Western University in Colorado. So, it's not just one institution that's sending these requests. You got to really look at also the vested interest in the development and the maintenance of the relationship, and how it can be reciprocal, and where you go from there. Because it's not just putting words down on paper, it's hopefully establishing some type of working relationship, be it an internship down the road for a budding anthropologist from the tribe, or one of the tribes that you have the land acknowledgement with. Or, how do you really move beyond just the words on the paper? And I think that kind of comes back full circle to intent. Is that, what is the intent behind it? Are you really wanting to put forth the energy to develop and nurture and grow a relationship? Or is it just, requesting the help on the land acknowledgement and that's it? So I think it does go back to the overall intent of not only the land acknowledgement, but potentially what comes from that building of the relationship. Thank you.
Thank you.
My only 2 cents, this is Cassandra. My 2 cents in this is that it is a living document, but if we're talking about, does it change every 2 years? Like sometimes we'll get something that says, is this still important to the tribe? Can we change this? Do we want to do that? And sometimes that is, so I think it is dependent on what it is you're trying to change. And if you're asking a tribe, is this still important? Then the perception and the answer will be yes, because that perspective does not change. If it was important to the tribe then it's still important and it still has value. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think on that note, I think the other thing is, if you've created a land acknowledgement and you've gone through all the ceremony and pomp of having the tribe's delegation and their tribal council and all of that, it's like, so in 2 years, are you going to redo that if you do the wording? So I think that's the other thing is, you have to measure that your own in what that is. And also, like Garrett said, growing relationships out of that. But I've even had schools, elementary schools, new high schools on the Wasatch Front. I've gotten several requests from those types of places. Part of that is that they want have that reinforcement for tribes being present and presenting their histories and their cultures to those school-age children. I wholly support. I always say, you know, all children are our future. Those young urbanites are one day going to be our senators and our governors, whatever. And sure, we want those in. We've got some of our supporters. So, you know, it's always good to get that future generations, all future generations, to support tribes in their positions. So, you know, I look at it like that too.
Great. Well, I would love to hear someone share a really good experience that you've had working with another organization, somebody who you thought, you know, did everything the right way and made you wish, like, why can't it all be like this? Or maybe you haven't had that experience yet, but I'd love to, you know, hear what it feels like whenever it goes well, I guess.
My good experience, this is Cassandra, is with the U Indian Museum expansion. That U Indian Museum expansion in Montrose, which morphed into a 5-year project at History Colorado in Denver, I think had its hiccups, but I think overall those exhibits and that museum expansion was true collaboration with the 3 sister tribes and with, you know, with our government leaders, you know, our leadership endorsing it, and with the hard work and with the staff and going through the steps from schematics, from planning, all the way up to the wood, all the way up to the exhibits, all the way up to different things when it came to acknowledging that Ute history and that Ute presence. And maybe it, you know, that is one. And then working with History Colorado for the Denver exhibit, written on the land, which was a spin-off of the other one, and of the one in Montrose. And I think for me, having that also include as a living exhibit of contemporary that we're still here and that we weren't in black and white, to me acknowledged us and acknowledged our presence on our own cultural landscape. And so that's one that I think that has been really good, a good project and collaboration and consultation in that best sense. Thank you.
And go ahead, Betsy, if you want to share.
Okay. I think collaboration with History Colorado, as Casey had mentioned, they are on top of it, History Colorado, in collaboration with tribes. As far as land acknowledgement, I worked with elementary school in Steamboat Springs. I've been working with them for over a year and a half now, and they're in creating a land acknowledgement and also the presence of the Ute tribe within their school. And I think, you know, engaging the tribe and engaging the people, not only our cultural resource office, but our education department, and bringing some of our kids over to share. There are a number of examples of that within Colorado. The Mount Garfield School in Grand Junction is another case. But they've really, they've not only put that work on paper, but they've also engaged. They've really stepped it up in that manner. And, you know, I think the other success is the University of Utah with the Ute tribe here in Fort Duchesne. That's a big success. We've been there since the 80s. And they've stepped up, they've come back out and asked for some more activities, because they were supposed to have ended that utilization of the Ute drum there, but that's been extended. And I think the tribe and all of its tribal councils over the years have always felt that was a success. We have a number of scholarships with that university. We wholeheartedly embrace them in using the youth, the running youth as their mascot. And I think that is a overall success story too in a big way. So I think there are a number of good places to look at for collaboration and success stories, but there are a lot of places to look of do's and don'ts too. Thank you.
All right, so we have a couple questions coming in. We have an anonymous question. Thanks so much for hosting this panel. It's been very informative. I'm wondering how much of the land acknowledgement movement has been driven by tribal members and governments versus Euro-American organizations. So anyone want to take that on?
Go ahead, Garrett.
Just a couple of things I'd like to say. It's not like we don't have enough to do that we're reaching out there and saying, hey, you should do that. In my experience, it's been driven a lot by the Euro-Americans. And that's why I think the language that I talk about trying to write these has been so, it's been such a real hard thing for me to ask when I'm reading that. And also the acknowledgements sometimes get like a whole page long, which I think sometimes that's way over. Anyway, that's my experience.
As Ms. Chapuz mentioned, I mean, that's pretty much what we've been seeing. There's been an obvious uptick in requests to our office that we've received within the last, I'd say 2 years easily. When I started in 2017, I didn't see anything come in with respect to land acknowledgements. So I'd say within, 2019 to current time is really where we've seen the biggest influx. And it's not us going out there saying, let's work on a land acknowledgement. It has been requests primarily in our office, or actually exclusively in our office. Thank you.
Cassandra, Garrett, what Garrett and Ms. Chapuz says is right. And for me, man, I go out there and I go hound people and tell them, you need to remember I was here. Fake. I'm just kidding. We have a lot of stuff on our plate. So if I had time to do that, I would definitely do that. But, I think that it's the opposite way. And it might be because people are becoming more cognizant, or it might be because maybe they've seen more tribal people out there, I guess, speaking out on different issues and that coming around. Thank you.
And this is Betsy, and I'll just for like Garrett was saying, about 2 years ago, I probably worked on 5, 6 land acknowledgements. In this past year, I've worked on 4. So I think, with all that's happening in the world, with all of the racial issues, I think that's raised the consciousness, and I think that has really brought that forward. And like I mentioned before, in the state of Utah, the governor did sign an executive order that would send out to all their departments for them to create land acknowledgements. But I'm seeing a lot coming out of the private sector too.
So then a sort of follow-up question to that is, in your experience, do tribes find value in organizations initiating those land acknowledgement statements? Are you glad to have all this extra work, or are you just like, ugh, to help all these people do?
Cassandra, I am on the fence with that question because it's loaded either way, on both sides. It is extra, but it's nice that people are acknowledging. Because there are times when we've said, hey, where are we in this picture? We were here too, and so maybe we've created our own monster by speaking out like that. But, I think that I'm right in the middle there. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Cruz.
I was just going to say that it's a two-edged sword, a double-edged sword. I think it really in my experience, it depends on the organization and what their intent is. Because I gave that example of somebody that just didn't want to acknowledge how the tribal folks were moved out of these places. And then in another instance, you have people that are very sincere and want to really acknowledge the tribes and where they've been and their history that's tied to that. So I think it's a double-edged sword, and it just, as far as the workload on that, I kind of, like Casey, it's good to see it, but the workload is pretty heavy.
All right, so we have about 15 minutes left. I will encourage everyone who's been watching, please drop your questions over in the Q&A. I have another question for all of you that I'm interested. Is it, in your opinion, is it worse to have a poorly researched and ill-intended land acknowledgement or just none at all? Which would you prefer to see?
Personally, this is Garrett. I would prefer to see nothing if it's poorly written and poorly researched, because what's going to happen is what has happened in academia since more or less the beginning of time with the settlement of the West, is that those who hold the pen write the history, and it'll start to be referenced. So it starts a snowball effect of misinformation and disinformation. And it may not be the intent of the individual, like, again, as we kind of circle back to some of the major themes, intent, or who is the proponent of the land description, or, you know, why is it being discussed and why is it being developed? Is it to fulfill an objective because the governor issued a statement to all the state agencies saying that you must do this, so they're going to do it anyways? And I think it also comes back to the fact of, you know, if a tribe doesn't want to be involved, you should also consider that as a respectable response, and just say, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't write, you know, land acknowledgement if it's out of the volition of one person. So I think that personally, I would rather see nothing written at all if it was poorly written, just because it gets perpetuated and used by other people and referenced. Thank you.
This is Betsy. I agree with Garrett. I've had a few places that have started finding they've wanted to use certain things that I did not agree with, that was not part of the history of that area, or that, and it's hard to first of all to get them to understand where you're coming from. The other thing is, if they're just persistent, then in my case, I just tell them, you know, I don't have time to finish this and to explain, trying to go through this, and we're kind of at a bumping heads. So I've just told them, you know, your land acknowledgement, if that's what you want to do, then you need to write it the way you want. I've put my input in, and I'm not going to spend any more time. So then it created a bad situation that now, you know, as tribes, we have very long memory, and that will stand here in my office for a while. But I couldn't see moving forward with the land acknowledgement in the way that they wanted to trade that.
Thank you. All right. Let's see if I have any other questions on my list. So first steps, let's kind of get down to logistics and brass tacks. I think a lot of our organizations in this panel hopefully took away from this that, you know, creating a statement the right way is work for both them, but also for the people that they are consulting with. And, you know, it's not something that can happen on a timeline. And, you know, it's really going to be a true collaboration. So what are your suggestions for like the best first steps that a museum could take if they are ready to do the work to create a land acknowledgement?
My advice would be to do your research a little bit, and as Mr. Ask somebody who already works with the tribe and make sure you're contacting the official cultural preservation representatives. That would be step one in my book.
Betsy, I think you need to drop off all your assumptions and do that first step that Garrett said, and really listen what your the people that you're working with, what they're saying to you.
Excellent.
I think you need to come to the terms and facts, come to terms with yourself that it's not gonna be just your first time. That it's going to be a work in progress, and to realize that what you think of is only going to take a couple of drafts might take more time than you think about than what it is that what you think was going to be allocated for that. And so I think, like Mr. Poos and Mr. Briggs said, is reaching out to the proper people, and then knowing that it's going to take more time than you actually think. And that, and that's part of one of those assumptions that you need to drop. And to know that, and to take it as a growing experience. I think that when you just write something down and you don't have, and you're just writing it and there's no feeling or empathy attached to it, then it becomes just a piece of paper with words. Thank you.
Another thing that I'd like to express is that when you do get to the writing stage or drafting stage, as Ms. Chapus and Ms. Atencio both mentioned, is that words matter. So look at not only recognizing their ancestors' presence on the land that you're acknowledging, but also the continued cultural connection to those areas, because even though we are no longer in our ancestral territories, those places still matter. And they matter so not just because it's tied to our oral history, but also most often to traditions, prayers, and so forth. So it's really acknowledging the fact of words matter, and that, for example, there will be some contention, depending on who you're consulting with, regarding Native American, Indian, the distinction between both. I mean, it's going to come down to a lot of the colloquial discussions, but also with the historical underpinnings of certain terms. So just be prepared to consider those things moving forward.
So we do have another question that popped up. This one's more NAGPRA specific. Do you think NAGPRA should or one day will extend to historic documents and photos that are currently being held in museums? So should the definition of what falls under those NAGPRA guidelines be expanded in the future?
Can you repeat the question?
Do you think NAGPRA should or one day will extend to historic documents and photos that are currently being held by museums?
I thought those were already a part of it, and a part of your consultation. If museums are holding them back, then they're not providing you all the information that they already have, and that should already be a part of it when you're discussing that repatriation effort. And I think it depends on, and I think some of that should be, what is the right thing to do? What is the inherent thing? This is a NAGPRA isn't. It's a human nature law. It's a human law, okay? And it's not about, this is semantics. This is what we have to do under the letter of the law, but it's more about. Thank you.
All right, so in our last few minutes, feel free to drop in any last minute questions. Ms. Atencio, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we had planned on possibly having you read your land acknowledgement statement at the beginning of this session. Would you be willing to do that for us now? Are you prepared to do that? Can you hear me? Would you be willing to give us your land acknowledgement statement now?
Which land acknowledgement statement?
Oh, that's a great question. So the reason why I tracked you guys down was I saw you presenting at the Saving Places conference, and you did a very lovely land acknowledgement statement for that. But if you're not prepared, then I certainly won't force you to say it. But I think it would be helpful for everyone to kind of hear, you know, what does a good land acknowledgement statement sound like?
The one that I did for CPI?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to tell you guys something. Land acknowledgements for me are not written, so I don't have a prepared script that I did. And that's the portion from me as a tribe and being a tribal person and being connected to my landscape, that I was able to do that from my heart and to be able to do it. It took me about 15 takes, okay? I'm not going to lie about that. But in all reality, my land acknowledgement statement was something that we did that from the heart, and knowing my history and knowing the people that we interacted with, the other tribes, and knowing where we were at and where we were placed, was why I was able to do that in the manner that I was able to do it. So it depends on who you are, on how you're able to convey those that type of acknowledgement. You can play it if you want, or do you want me to?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. So if you have that video available and you'd like to share, that's fine. In the meantime, I just want to, again, thank all of you for coming in and having this discussion with us. I know just in the few conversations that I've had, you've really taught me a lot and changed my perspective a great deal on what land acknowledgements are and what they should be. So I definitely appreciate it. We're getting a lot of great feedback in the chats and in our Q&A that our visitors from museums are finding this panel to be very informative and very helpful. So hopefully, you know, we've kind of set the stage to create some real change in this area.
This is Betsy. I just want to say something very quickly, that if museums need to find people in their area, they can also turn to the National Parks website for tribal historic preservation officers throughout the United States. And that's another good place for them to look for people that they may contact.
Thank you. All right, final chance for Q&A.
I have it right here. Hold on.
All right, Ms. Atencio, if you click the little screen button right below the images, you can actually share your screen with us.
That one? Okay, so then. Share screen. Wait, share your screen, your entire screen. Is that what I hit?
So it should be a picture of a little rectangular screen and it has a red line through it. If you click on that one, it'll share your screen.
Now can you see it?
I cannot.
What I can see is you looking intently at your screen.
Hold on, let me see this then. Let me see. Yeah, not email. I can't. Okay.
You know what, Miss?
What's this? How do I turn it? Oh, I gotta hit share, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, share. And that's the one you're leaving. Okay, right now. Now can you see it?
We sure can. Oh, I think you're gonna have to click share your audio. So there's a little checkbox that says share audio.
Hey, wait.
And if we can't get it to work, it's all right. I can
I
always
can't
upload
get
it.
it to work.
All right, that's just fine. I thank you for trying. But if you do want to send me that video, I can always upload it right onto this page so that anybody can watch it.
Okay.
And that might be a good choice anyway, because then everyone can watch it on their own time.
Okay, it's in a Dropbox, and so.
All right, we'll figure it out. We'll get it up there for everyone to see. All right, well, thanks again, all of you. We are right at 4 o'clock now. So I want to thank you and also for all of our attendees for coming to our first day ever of our first virtual conference ever. You know, things went about as smoothly as everyone could have hoped. So thank you to everyone who participated, and thank you for having a little grace and bearing with me and with us as we worked through this. Tomorrow morning at 8:30, we will have a little warm-up morning yoga session, so some museum yoga to get you started before we dive into our sessions. So thanks again, everyone, and I will see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Good night.
Yeah.